Okay, it is 6 o'clock. I'm Andy Johnson, one of the facilitators of the International Literacy Coalition. We have a great speaker today, and I'll be turning on the chat in just a minute. A reminder, our last ILEC webinar of the school year will be on Tuesday, May 13th, and we will have another teacher panel there. I will be turning on the chat so you can have a conversation there. I encourage you at the end to ask any questions. I'll also be happy to turn on your voice so that you can hear that. So without delay, Shawna Coppola, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and I'll make my bald head disappear.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's so nice to be here. And I'm just really excited to see some familiar names. And those of you who I don't know, I hope that I get to hear a little bit from you tonight as well. As part of my introduction, is part of my slides. But before I start my presentation tonight, I just want to let folks know that my sweet little baby dog had oral surgery today. It was postponed from another date. So she's sitting sort of at my feet moaning, coming off the narcotics. And so at some point, my family will come home and we'll take her. So there'll just be a little interruption, most likely. All right, now that I've said that, we can get started. So welcome to tonight's webinar that I have called Literacy for All, a framework for anti-oppressive teaching. It is based around my newest book of the same name, but hopefully if you have already read it, you will hear some different things since it's been over a year now since I've written it or had anything to do with changing it. And I've learned so much since then. And if you haven't, hopefully if you like what you heard tonight, you'll be able to have a chance to go possibly to the book at some point and just get some details and some really practical ideas for the classroom. So thank you again for joining tonight. So my name is Shawna Coppola. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Abenaki and Pennacook tribes. And I currently work in a lot of capacities. I'm an education consultant. I've spent about 25 years in public education, K to 12. But currently I teach undergraduates first year composition at a local community college, which is something I am loving so much. I learn so much from my students every single day. And I'm also a new graduate student, a doctoral student at Antioch University. And so I'm really excited to be back in that kind of digging into my special interest kind of world with other people from all over the world as partners. So what you see here with the QR code is a digital handout that will also show up at the end of the presentation. So if you miss it right now, don't worry, it will come back. And that handout just has some information on there. Some of the references that I use tonight will be there. And contact information is also there. So definitely take advantage of that. So I wanted to start by pointing to standpoint theory. And some of you might be familiar with this, some of you might not. But this really comes from one of my newly favorite scholars. Now that I've started my doctoral program, her name is Patricia Hill Collins. Many of you might be already very familiar with her work. She's a transdisciplinary scholar, and she has written a piece called Learning from the Outsider Within, the Sociological Significance of Black Feminist Thought. And she talks about this idea of standpoint theory. She says that outsiders within, who she calls outsiders within, occupy a special place. Their difference sensitizes them to patterns that may be more difficult for established insiders to see. And this really resonated with me because I have, as many of us do, both insider group status as well as outsider group status. And so a lot of things in the context of literacy and education point to my insider group status. So the fact that I am a white cisgender English speaker is my first language. I'm a US citizen. Those are some things that give me that insider group status. The outsider group status in this context is due to my neurodiversity. So I am ADHD and I'm also autistic. And in certain contexts, that does disable me. So, for example, tonight, and sometimes in my classroom, sometimes my language fails me because my executive function is working so hard to regulate my emotions and help me sort of stay organized in my brain. And that can be really hard. And some of you may or may not be able to see that I've been stimming since I started talking tonight. And that is part of my autism, but it does help me regulate. I'm also a queer woman. And in many instances, especially in literacy spaces, these, and depending on the spaces, but in particularly in the space where I do most of my work now, which is in higher education, especially being a woman gives me a little bit of that outsider group status. And I'm able to see and notice things, especially around literacy, languaging practices, pedagogy, neurodiversity, and so on and so forth, that certainly aren't necessarily things that I was able to see in another context. But I definitely notice these things, and that's part of, I think, what helps me kind of see the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight and helps me kind of notice them. So I wanted to share that with you and also ask you to think about what your standpoint might be in this particular context. Now, some of you may have started reading this amazing book. It was just released not too long ago by Noliwe Rooks. She has written many other things that I love. And her latest book, Integrated, traces the impact of school integration or school desegregation and integration through the story of her own family through 4 generations. And I wanted to start with her because in chapter 1 of this book, she describes a 2021 lawsuit filed on behalf of several students in New York City. And this lawsuit explicitly names the educational, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and physical harm that so many students were subjected to in their K-12 experience as a result of the inherent racism that was part of their educational experiences. And she says that the type of racism that the lawsuit described was not about an individual who held discriminatory thoughts and intent. It was not about a particular teacher who blocked a student's access to a special program, but rather it was about an entire system designed to deliver subpar educational experiences to children, in this case, who are Black and Latino. And I just thought that was a really important quote to use to kind of frame this entire webinar tonight, because that's really what my framework that I'm going to talk about is about. It's not about the individual necessarily, those individual instances, but really the system itself, and especially the more implicit aspects of our schooling and our literacy pedagogy practices and policies that really tend to harm. I guess there's no other word for it. And so I wanted to start with that because as I was reading that first chapter, I was like, oh, this is exactly, and this is why I love her work, because what she says so resonates with me so often. So before I share a little bit about the framework just as a whole, I just want to say that this framework is really just a starting point for creating less oppressive and more liberatory literacy experiences for children and youth. It's obviously not the end-all be-all. I would say that it's necessary, but not sufficient to dismantle or start to dismantle the kind of system that Rooks and other people describe. So the framework, because I wanted something visual to share with folks, these things, these principles that are part of the framework are compartmentalized, but they really are tangled up together. And sometimes it can be really hard to piece them out because they're so tangled together. But I did my best to kind of compartmentalize them so that I can talk about aspects of our literacy pedagogy that fit sort of under these principles and that we need to keep in mind so that together and holistically we can start to work toward a more anti-oppressive literacy pedagogy. So the pieces of the framework that I feel that educators need to really embody, they need to both recognize and also seek to educate themselves, their students, and others around these key principles. So the first one is that literacy involves both cognitive processes and social practices. And a lot of these are going to sound really sort of what a lot of folks call common sense. I've started to call it holistic sense because things that are common sense to some are not common sense to others. And I think it's important to name those things so that we're all clear about them, even if we think, well, we should all know this anyway. The second one is that identity and literacy are inexplicably linked together. All human beings engage in literacy and language practices that are both valid and valuable. Meaning making occurs within a variety of equally valid communicative channels or modes. And literacy can be used as a tool for liberation as well as a tool for oppression. So I'm going to start with the first one here. And I think for the most part, I kind of go in order tonight. But as I talk a little bit more in depth about each of these principles, I want to ask you to keep this question in mind. Where does literacy oppression hide despite our quote unquote best intentions? And throughout, I'll give some examples of where I have found that literacy oppression tends to hide the most and give some examples of my personal experience as well as those of other scholars whose shoulders I stand on and who I'm in community with around this work. So let's start with the first one. Literacy involves both cognitive processes and social practices. So researchers within some scientific disciplines claim the following. One is that our brains are hardwired to learn language. And I have some citations there, but there are many others within certain scientific disciplines who claim this. The second is that our brains are not hardwired to learn to read printed text. The third is that humans share some common in-the-head processes when learning to read and write this printed text. And what tends to go unsaid and sometimes therefore unnoticed is that these claims are, for the most part, as many of you know, these claims are based on research with neurotypical subjects for the most part, and also monolingual subjects as well, especially people who their first language or their language, their first or their only language that they can speak and write in fluently is one that has an alphabetic orthography like English, like French, like Italian. And these claims and sort of putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, around these claims really represents the autonomous model of literacy that Brian Street talked about in his work. And he, for those of you who aren't familiar with his work, he was a British anthropologist and professor of language. And the autonomous model or autonomous conceptions of literacy really, I think, maintain an insidious hold on educators and policymakers. And he talks about how this autonomous model, which is autonomous in a sense of any kind of ideology or value or belief system, this idea that it's subjective and neutral, tends to uphold oppressive systems by legitimizing the occlusion of access to quote unquote academic spaces for people with diverse life experiences. And in this case, for people with diverse language and literacy practices. And this really is very much demonstrated around the science. And I have the science in quotation marks because it's often called that, the science of reading, not the sciences. And I think that there's an important caveat to make when we think about the science of reading. And I want to quote this scholar Landerl and her colleagues who talk about the fact that cross-linguistic studies of how humans learn to read are dominantly carried out in the context of Western alphabetic orthographies. So they write that even if non-Western writing systems such as Arabic or Chinese are the subject of investigation, this research often attempts to confirm the validity of precurses of reading identified for English. So it's very much English based and therefore very much Western based, this so-called only science or what do they call it? Settled science. However, we also know that there are researchers within other scientific disciplines that have these claims: that literacy practices are socially, culturally, historically, politically, and ecologically embedded practices. So they're very contextual. That what counts or is valued as literacy and who is considered literate is based on underlying assumptions and ideologies. So it's not autonomous, it's actually ideological. And I really appreciate these claims because it takes into account, sorry, I just want to make sure my pups, okay, I think my daughter took it. It really takes into account neurodiversity, which is so important. It takes into account people who speak and write and consume a wide variety of languages and not just alphabetic orthographies. And it also takes into account varying modes and forms of text. So not just printed text, which it's really, so many scholars have been arguing for decades upon decades that we have this insidious hold on printed text. And we really do need to, I mean, it's past due time for us to really make sure that we're incorporating multiple and varying modes and forms of text into our pedagogy. And so, of course, this is not an autonomous view, but it's an ideological view. It claims its ideology, and it's not pretending that there is some kind of neutrality or universality or subjectivity to sciences of literacy. And so this first principle really matters, this idea that literacy encompasses both cognitive and social, cultural, historical, and so on practices. And this matters because when we recognize literacy practices as having both cognitive and social, etc. practices, so it involves both. What we're doing is we're better able to recognize which communities' literacy practices are centered most often, especially in school spaces, and are held up as the standard. And we're also more apt to be critical in a good way of claims of objectivity, like I said, universality and neutrality within science and education, which, as we know, is impossible. A couple of other reasons why this principle matters, and it's important for us to, I guess, not just say, oh, yeah, I agree with that, but to be very vocal about it and to be explicit about it, is because this can also help us and our colleagues acknowledge, and our students acknowledge how dominant literacy practices impact which literacy practices are most often taught and assessed in school spaces, how literacy practices are often taught and assessed, and who that privileges, and who is most often identified as being quote unquote proficient or literate. So, just because of the time, I'm going to move a little quickly, but this will be as it is being recorded, so you can always go back and pause and kind of think through these a little bit more, not so quickly. But the second principle in my framework is that identity and literacy are inextricably linked. And again, this is one of those things that a lot of folks, especially those of you here tonight, would say, well, of course it is. But it's something that I think we really need to be more explicit about. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, and you may have done this before in a different context, but I'm going to ask you over the next, let's say 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you to complete the sentence stem that's at the top of this slide, I am. And I want you to use whatever phrases or words pop into your head. So when you think I am blank, I want you to list as many thoughts as you can. Don't stop to judge your thinking or to evaluate it or to think, is this what Shawna is asking? Is this the right way to do it? Just concentrate on eliciting as many personal responses as possible. So I am what? Just list as many as you can. Okay. So this is from, and many of you may have heard this already. This is a pretty common sort of exercise. I've done it several times in different contexts with different facilitators. But this originally comes, I think it's original to Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's essay called The Complexity of Identity, which I have linked in my digital handout, which I'll show you again at the end. And she does this often, or she had done this often with her students when she was teaching. I think she was specifically teaching undergrads. And one of the things that she notices is that when she does this exercise, she writes that common across the examples that she gives in the essay in terms of what a lot of her students' answers are, is that in the areas where a person is a member of the dominant or advantaged social group, the category is usually not mentioned. It's often taken for granted because it's taken for granted by the dominant culture. And if I think back to the first time I was asked to do this, I think, I don't think I mentioned my whiteness. I don't think I mentioned the fact that I was, sort of a European, my family's were European settlers. I don't think I mentioned the fact that I'm a monolingual English speaker or a US citizen, anything like that. And then the more I did, the more I started to do a lot of really important identity work, the more I started to realize that I really was missing those. I wasn't thinking of myself in terms of the dominant or advantaged social groups. I was only thinking of myself in terms of how I felt like that outsider sort of status. And I really appreciate models like this. You may have seen different variations of it. I use a different variation in my book. But this one comes from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and it's typically called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. It's not intended to capture all areas of marginalization, but it's really there to provide a framework through which to view power and privilege. And in theory, it's really helpful. I've used this with a lot of teacher groups that I've worked with around identity and race and that sort of thing. And so I find it really helpful to start conversations. But I also think that there's a lot that we can sort of criticize about this model. But again, just like with any model that we're trying to sort of help us visualize something, it's really hard to do that in a way that picks up all the nuances. So when we think about power and privilege, what this model is trying to show is that those identities that are closer to the middle tend to have the most power in societies. And the further you get away from the middle, the less power that you have. And again, these don't encompass every area of marginalization. So one that for me stands out as not being here is body size and body type. So that's a huge area of marginalization and also of power in different contexts. But I think that this helps us see how our identities and others' identities sort of intersect and work in contrast to each other. And I think it helps us see how systemic patterns are reinforced within systems and institutions that advantage some and disadvantage others. I don't agree with many of these. I think in different contexts, certain identities have power and in other contexts they don't. I also don't agree as a woman who just turned 50 and a week ago. I don't agree that, middle-aged women have more power than youth. Certainly, in some ways, I feel very powerful, but in other ways, I feel very invisible. And there's multiple examples that I could give here where this doesn't quite work. Another sort of example that doesn't show up in this model is around. Let me see if I can find it. Sexual orientation and gender identity, that sort of thing, because I think a lot of when we think about some of these examples, and for me, that my queerness is not visible, whatever that means. In a lot of spaces, I've been told that I don't seem queer, I don't look queer. And so I think, that's where there's some problematic things here. But again, I think it's a useful tool. And when I think about my identities, my varying identities, I think about how these different aspects of my identity have impacted not only how I see myself as a literacy learner and as a learner in general, but also how I'm seen as a literate being. So I think it really does help open up conversations. And so, of course, we talked so many times about the importance of identity in terms of the texts and practices that we value, but especially texts. And so this question that we've been asked and answered multiple times around, are all children seeing their identities, their communities and experiences reflected in the text they're asked to read? I want us to remember that we're thinking of text very broadly. So it's not just about books, but making sure that we're thinking of different forms and modes of text as well. And of course, so many people, for good reason, quote Rudine Sims Bishop's work around mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, as well as Dr. Debbie Reese's work, where she includes curtains as well. I think one of the things that is not talked often enough, although I've definitely heard this among colleagues, but the importance not just of having different identities and multiple identities represented, so to speak, but how are they represented? And are they represented in ways that are just kind of living their lives or having joyful lives and experiences? Or is it always about oppression, and marginalization? Many of us have also seen the Diversity in Children's Books infographic, where there was a group of scholars did an audit of over 3,000 books and came up, kind of did this work and the data showed the percentage of books depicting characters from diverse backgrounds. Again, though, this doesn't take into account how people or characters are depicted, but just kind of the frequency. So I think it's just a really nice, again, conversation starter. And I also link to this in my digital handout as well. However, again, I think it's important for us to remember that this is not just about optics and representation. It's about how, not just the what, but the how, and not just the who, but how are people being represented in text and not just books. It's all kinds of text. It's the text on your walls. It's the videos. It's the articles that you read. It's the spoken word poetry that you listen to, and so on and so forth. So this obviously goes very hand in hand with this next one, that meaning making, I should say, the identity piece around identity and literacy being linked really goes hand in hand with this idea of meaning making can occur and does occur within a variety of equally valid communicative channels or modes. And so in this case, I want us to think about the text that we invite students to both consume and compose. So when we think, even just thinking of the materials, or the let's just say the paper materials, even, we're kind of narrowing it down even further. So the kinds of materials that we often have available in our classrooms, for, as children move through the grades, it changes quite a bit. So when they're much younger, we have materials that look like this, and hopefully we have blank paper as well, and all kinds of different surfaces and different materials. But when we're just thinking about paper, we tend to see this a lot in these younger grades. And then as students get older, it starts to look more like this. And so something that you may have noticed is that the space for visual composition starts to fade away. And the opportunity to compose visual text alongside alphabetic text starts to fade away as well. And those opportunities become fewer and fewer the older that students get. So it really speaks to the dominance of print-based text. But I think it also, in some ways, just with the composition book and the blue book, it speaks to the dominance of essayist forms of writing, composition. It speaks to, I don't know, I just feel like that blue book and even the composition book really just reminds me of the dominance of informational and analytical genres, and how these are so ubiquitous the older students get. And I know this because I've lived it in my experience, but also as an undergraduate, as a teacher of undergraduates in a first year composition course, we do a lot of talking about their experiences in K-12. And I give them multiple opportunities throughout the semester to compose creatively and multimodally. And they either are like, oh my gosh, I've never been able to do this before. This is so fun. Or they're just, oh my gosh, what do I do? Because I've never done this before. So it's really fun. I try to, give them an opportunity because their worlds represent multimodality. They see multimodal forms all over the place. And so I think it's really important to obviously give them chances to compose and consume them as readers and viewers. So not only is this important because of the ubiquitous of multimodal forms in our world, but it's also important because of the different sort of traditions and expressions and ways that a lot of different communities create and tell stories and pass knowledge down, pass knowledge among people in the community. So for example, oral traditions and expressions are used to pass on knowledge and social and cultural values and collective memory. They really play a crucial part in keeping many cultures and communities alive. And so I really think that this is a place where oppression really hides, is within, when we think about the dominance of print text and the dominance of informational and analytical texts. Because those are the ones that we tend to invite students to consume and compose the most. So you can see lots of different examples. We have spoken word. We have this beautiful, this is a graphic version or a graphic comic, picture books, TikToks, and other kinds of video sort of essays and stories. I think even, I did, oh gosh, this is so many years ago now. I think it was 9 or 10 years ago, maybe, where I co-taught with a kindergarten teacher who is one of the best teachers I've ever known in my life. And we actually did a study with the children around clothing and t-shirts and stereotypes and stuff like that. So we did a lot of reading of fabric and t-shirts and other kinds of clothing materials. But protest art is a really important form, especially now. I think it's just, I shouldn't say especially now, it's always been, but I think now it's really visible these days. And so that's a beautiful text or form of text to kind of explore with students. Memes, they love memes, and memes are such a great way to talk about inferencing and humor and culture, because a lot of the things that they're so culturally and socially situated. Memes, sometimes you get them and sometimes you don't, and that has a lot to do with your social and cultural lives and connections. And so again, I always ask us to kind of reflect, are all children and youth seeing their community valued practices in the texts that they're invited to consume and compose in school spaces? And I'm highlighting these books, yes, one of which is mine, because I see there are a lot of great books about multimodal composition, but I don't see a lot that have practical applications or that connect directly to ideas and lessons that you can use now. I see a lot that are more theoretical, which is also really important. So these are some that I really think do that and provide some really practical ideas. But I want us to think about, incorporating a lot more around oral stories in our pedagogy, comics and graphic novels, which have traditionally been used as counter narratives to dominant narratives. Spoken word, which is really important in a lot of different communities, especially African American communities. Infographics, which we see everywhere, video narratives, all these kinds of texts. And I'll talk about this a little bit later too, but those of you who know me know I love zines. And a zine is a form that's really been important for communities that have been traditionally marginalized in a lot of different ways. They've been really important to feminist spaces, to queer spaces, Black spaces. Or Black communities. There are a lot of communities that really find zines to be a great way to share stories and information among members of their communities. So let's just take a quick brain break. And I just want to give us about 30 seconds to kind of breathe and to think about some questions. What's resonating with you so far of what I'm talking about? And you can just kind of think this through or drop your thinking in the chat. And more importantly, what wonders or questions are kind of rising to the surface for you? So just take a moment to think about that, and we'll come back in just about 30 seconds. All right. So we will keep going, but definitely there will be opportunity at the end to ask questions or share your thinking or anything that's resonating with you. So let's talk next about how all human beings engage in literacy and language practices that are both valid and valuable. I want to start with a meme that some of you might be familiar with and some of you might not be. So again, memes are very, like comics, are very socially and culturally situated. So if you don't know Family Guy and you don't know this episode, you might not get the meme, but you might also be able to infer what the meme is saying here. So when we think about language and literacy practices, and the ones that we value over the ones that we tend not to, or the ones that we tend to ignore entirely, or position as sort of a deficit in school spaces. This is so obviously tied to race, ethnicity, culture. And so this particular meme, this is called the Family Guy skin color meme. If you look it up, you'll see lots of different versions of it. I always find it to be ironically kind of, I think memes and creating memes is a really great way to let off steam with a little dash of humor. And this one comes from, like I said, the animated show Family Guy, which is a satire. It's a satire, a satirical animated show. And in this episode, a toll booth worker holds a skin tone chart up to Peter Griffith, the main character, to determine if he's white enough to pass through to the United States. And so I want us to think about this in terms of language and how we position language and who is called certain things, who is called what, how we frame being multilingual or bilingual, depending on your skin color, your ethnicity, your cultural status. And I just think it's an interesting sort of way to think about this. This particular aspect of the framework. Two of my favorite scholars that do a lot of work in linguistics and sociolinguistics in particular, Dr. Nelson Flores and Dr. Jonathan Rosa. One of the things that they do so much great work together, but one of my favorite quotes from them is that for students of color, the goal of language education is often the mastery of mainstream spoken and written language norms. And they say this is one of the ways in which the thinking that students of color should conform to white middle-class social norms and identity representations persists in school spaces. So it's just one of the ways that this persists, and one of the ways that we position language and which languages are centered or held up as the norm are really oppressive. They're one of the ways that you can see the oppression very explicitly in some respects and very implicitly in other respects. One example I'll give is a school I was working in a couple of years ago. And one of the first things when I asked them to tell me about themselves on the first day, I think I spent a few days with them twice throughout the year. So I visited them twice and spent a couple days with them. And the first day, I just, really wanted to have conversation and learn about them and learn about their communities. And I asked them to talk about their school and the students. And one of the things that they said right away was they were so proud because they said something like in the student body, there were, I think, over 20 languages represented. Excuse me. There were over 20 languages represented. Yay, spring. And I thought that was amazing. Like, how awesome is that? And so there were so many teachers in the building who were able to co-teach and work alongside teachers who specialize in working with multilingual and bilingual students. But one of the things that I noticed right away is that when you walked into their lobby, the only language that was represented was English. all of the welcome signs, all of the directional signs, all of the flyers. That was the only language represented. And that was something that was not appreciated that I pointed out. I waited some time. I did point it out at some point, and some people, the teachers who worked with a lot of multilingual and bilingual students were delighted that I said something, and a lot of the teachers who didn't feel, I think there was a sense that um, it was too critical, I guess, when I was just really pointing out something that I noticed. And that's kind of how I showed it. It's just that's how I demonstrated my noticing, is just saying something I'm noticing. It was really interesting is you said this, and that was really exciting. But then when I walked in the second day, I noticed this. And so that's just one of the ways of the ways that where the insidious nature of oppression and literacy go hand in hand. It's not always super obvious, I guess. Um, Dr. April Baker Bell, so many of you know and love her work as much as I do. She's written and spoken extensively about the ways in which Black students' languages, in particular, their languages and literacies, are often considered both invalid and invaluable in the majority, or less valued in the majority of school spaces. And of her time teaching English language arts in a Detroit area high school at the start of her educational career, this is one of the things that she wrote in her book. She said, she wrote, as a speaker of Black language myself, I recognized that my students were communicating in a language that was valid and necessary at home, in school, and in the hood, but I was receiving pressure from school administrators to get the students to use the quote, language of school. And so, like I said, I think this is one of the ways that oppression can really hide, is through these kind of, oh, what's the word for them? Colloquial, I can't say it, colloquialisms, I don't know. The things that we say, the phrases we use that really mean something underneath them. And so things like when we talk about standard English without kind of the quotes around it, or proper grammar or academic vocabulary, those are a lot of the ways in which this idea that there are certain languages and literacy practices that are valued and certain ones that aren't is really told, or the story that is shared with students through these kind of languages that we use and these kind of colloquialisms. I'm gonna have to practice that for my next one. And so, it's just something that we really need to be sharp about and make sure we're pointing it out when we see it and when we hear it. In my view, not everybody feels comfortable doing that, but I think the more we talk about it and the more we look at some of the ways that oppression hides in our school spaces, the less visible ways, the more insidious ways, I think we start to see them more often. And then everybody else starts to see, and you start to build capacity around that. And I also feel really strongly that related to this particular principle, that translanguaging is something that is not used enough in all school spaces. So not just with your students who are bilingual or multilingual, but using different languages with all students and sort of decentering that idea of white mainstream English, as Dr. Baker Bell calls it. And so I think, these are just some examples of texts that we can use. I love using music to really provide my students with instances of different languages. I love using poetry, but translanguaging, the practice of translanguaging, is a really beautiful and important way to unlearn the linguistic supremacy that is such an insidious part of our school system, and outside of our school system as well. So that is something that I really look to people like Carla España, Luz Herrera, Dr. Rosa. I think Luz is a doctor too, Dr. Herrera. I think Carla is too. Dr. España, um, Dr. Flores. One of my favorite podcasts is called The Vocal Fries. And if you're interested in different languages and language oppression, that is a wonderful podcast to start listening to. And they often talk about translanguaging. So it's just something that I really am excited to continue to learn more and more and more about. But I think we all need to engage in this work and encourage our students to use their translanguaging, especially our multilingual and bilingual students. Whenever there's some writing that they have to do in my composition classroom, I'm always telling them, I'm saying, you don't need my permission, but I just want you to know that I would love for you to use all of your linguistic repertoire as you're writing. I want you to, feel free to just, you don't always have to translate what you're trying to communicate into English. So the last piece, the last principle in my framework, as I start to wrap up, is actually my favorite one to talk about, but I'll keep it short because we're running out of time. And this one, I would love to write even more about. I think literacy is often heralded as a source of liberation, which it certainly can be in a lot of contexts, but I think it's also used so often, as we've seen throughout this presentation tonight, as a tool of oppression. And I really, really think it's important to talk about these things because there is that sort of sense that literacy liberates. It's going to interrupt the school to prison pipeline. And it's there's so much more than literacy that's going to do that, number one. But also, I think there are so many ways that we use literacy as a tool of oppression that we really need to talk more explicitly about. We all are aware of, different times in our country in America where literacy, anti-literacy laws were used, the rise of anti-literacy laws in the 19th century in particular to prevent African Americans from learning and speaking English, from learning to read and write English. The Chinese Exclusion Act was part of this entire wave of anti-immigration, and obviously Indian boarding schools was another area where people were just their literacies and languages were completely just oppressed and marginalized. This picture is so interesting to me because obviously English only laws is a part of that, using literacy as a tool of oppression. I always look at this guy right here. He's so angry. What is his, like, it's just like, why? I don't understand it. And of course, this is brand new, March 2025, this presidential action of designating English as the official language of the United States. It's just, there's so many ways that we use English as an assimilation tool, as a tool of oppression in particular, that most of us are aware of. But I think that there are so many more unspoken and sort of less visible ways that we use literacy as a tool of oppression. So obviously, I'll skip through. I have some slides around book bans. I'll kind of skip through that, but I did want to speak specifically to this whole idea of back to basics because these are just coming from some really recent headlines around the importance of bringing education back to basics. And I think that in terms of literacy, especially, is a way to, it's a harmful rhetoric because, we're just looking through these particular recent headlines, and there are so many more. But I think what's really important about this idea of back to basics is something that Ann Haas Dyson has said before, and she has so many books, but I chose 3 to show you. But she points out that literacy instruction focused on the basics is the most visible in schools serving low-income children. So when we talk about the need to go back to basics, oftentimes the students who get the very basics of literacy education are Black and Brown children. And this was also referenced in the recent Rethinking Schools piece by Ferguson, Rabinowitz, and Tondreau, when they write that multiple conservative parents' rights movements have argued that the quote, failure of balanced literacy is evidence of the failure of progressive education, and a back to basics approach is the solution. They say this parallels the rhetoric of Make America Great Again, advocating for a return to a curriculum that centers dominant white Christian ideologies. So I think we have to be really careful when we hear back to basics. It's one of those dog whistles. We should be like, because that's often hiding, or maybe not so well, that doesn't hide it very well if you're used to the rhetoric of back to basics, but for many people, they're not aware of how that rhetoric, where that rhetoric comes from, and who is most often kind of saddled with back to basics education, and what that means in school spaces, especially around literacy. So I'm going to skip through the book bans. We've talked about book bans so many times, but I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about literacy as a tool for liberation. Obviously, there are so many ways that literacy is also a tool for liberation that we need to celebrate. I mentioned zines and how queer zines, especially during the 80s and 90s with the rise of the AIDS epidemic, offered so much more than just queer creative content, but they were acts of protest, they were acts of activism, they were acts of preservation and communication as well. I think literacy is also used as a tool for liberation when we think about Indigenous language revitalization projects and processes. And this lovely woman right here is UC Davis professor Inez Hernandez Avila. And she has a public impact project that she's been working on for years around the endangered language of Nimipu Matki, not Matki. There's only 10 fluent speakers left. And so these Indigenous revitalization projects are really, really important and are just one example of how we can use literacy as a tool for liberation. So just sort of to end, I just want to reiterate that this framework is really the beginning step. And while there's no tried and true step-by-step process or black line master for creating the kinds of literacy spaces that our students deserve, we can definitely move toward the enactment of more anti-oppressive spaces by collectively and actively committing to these pieces in the framework. So to honoring and centering the languages and literacy practices of all people, by ensuring that our students are given opportunities to make meaning using a wide variety of forms, genres, and modes, by keeping our students and their identities, their experiences, their interests at the core of our literacy pedagogy, by contextualizing literacy within our past and current sociocultural realities, not just within that cognitive space, and by using literacy as a tool for dismantling oppressive systems and for collectively reimagining new systems. So I'm curious about what's resonating with you, what wonders or questions you have. And I'd love to hear some of those with the little tiny bit of time that we have. But again, I promised you I would put the QR code for my digital handout here. And so it is right there. I will also try to drop it in the chat as well. And I just want to thank you for being here tonight and for listening. And I would love to hear what you might be thinking about.
Shawna, incredible stuff. I learned what a zine is tonight.
Yay!
I never heard that term before. Do we have any questions from our studio audience or things you would like to? Uh, no need to respond to about zines, all right? Zine. Yep. I never heard the term either. Yeah, someone else mentioned that.
Oh, yay.
This is how vocabulary grows.
That's right.
Questions or things to ask Shawna about. So much related to what's going on politically right now. It's a scary time how literacy is being used to shut us down.
Absolutely.
And that's a scary part. That's what resonated with me, how it can be used for liberation and the flip side.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, especially with as teachers, we want to, we want to hold up literacy as just only this liberatory tool. It's just the way it's, it's the magic pill.
Yes.
um, but it's so often used to oppress. And I think that's a big part of, especially of American history. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that.
Anna asks, in the face of scripted curriculum, how do you suggest we can support students with your framework?
Well, I think we can. I like to start with inquiry, and so when I get asked a question like this, if I were a teacher in a school where we had a scripted curriculum or a lot of mandates, what I would do personally is I would have, I kind of partner with someone like-minded. This might not happen with someone in your school. It might have to be over social media, but just start to think about these pieces of the framework and think about, okay, where do we see examples of this, or where do we see this sort of in play, and start there and just sort of notice, think about what we notice and talk about what we notice. And I think through talking about what we notice, we can start seeing where the gaps might be and where we need to do a little bit more work.
What is the role of commercial curricula in your framework?
So I think there's a lot that we can do with commercial curricula that's part of this framework as well, especially with the language we use, the vocabulary we use. I think we can certainly go through. I think one of the first things to do with a commercial curricula, if you have the space, in some places you don't even have the space to supplement. But I worked with Dr. Tawanda Harris around with a commercial curriculum that a bunch of charter schools in Detroit were using for a while. And one of the things we did was help them look really critically at the texts that were a part of this curriculum, and how can we potentially supplement those texts to make it more inclusive. To start there might be a way that you could potentially start.
I was very interested in the back to the basics as a way of can you talk a little bit more about the back to the basics? Because people in diverse communities always see, well, there's this achievement gap, and we need to get back to the basics.
Yeah. I mean, I think so one of my favorite things to do, so of course, inquiry is, whenever I have a question like that, I just sort of start exploring. And one of my favorite things to do is by looking at old newspapers and old newspaper headlines, and looking at when has this back to basics language been used. And it's literally, so for as long as we've had school, there's been a call for back to basics education. It's just never gone away. And I think it's important to kind of think about, when we think about this, so one of the things with integrated, with Noliwe Brooks's book that's so important, is she talks about how schools now are as segregated as they have ever been. And one of the ways that they're segregated is who gets this back to basics education, who is placed in these remedial schools, even when they're in an integrated or desegregated school system. And so starting to look at things like that, like who is where, who is placed where, can help us think about who is getting that sort of basic education and who's getting a more robust, well-rounded, holistic sort of education that incorporates many more modes and forms of text, that incorporates many more different stories and opportunities to compose and that sort of thing.
Beth, Beth asks, Pablo Freire was most influential on my shift towards understanding literacy as liberatory. Do you see the struggle for liberation as incorporating, but going beyond literacy?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And that's why I started with this is, I think, necessary but not sufficient for for enacting liberatory spaces. I obviously there, we really have to completely dismantle what we have in order to build something new. But I think that starting to think about, I think the pieces of the framework and seeing how even like I said, with best intentions, how we are complicit in many of the ways that literacy can be oppressive and can harm. And then also celebrate the ways that we're really working toward that anti-oppressive liberatory pedagogy, I think is going to be really important. But yes, I absolutely see beyond literacy. I always think of that I think wasn't there was someone in the trial of George Zimmerman, there was someone who said something about, it was a Black woman, I believe, who said, um, you know, speaking perfect English or speaking the way you're supposed to speak did not help Trayvon Martin in that instance. And so when we talk about, you have to speak, as long as everyone has literacy, the way that we define it, which is so steeped in white supremacy and white mainstream norms, that can't save people of color, that can't save Black boys like Trayvon Martin. So it definitely is beyond literacy.
What is our role as educators?
Um, I mean, that's such a big question. I mean, I think for me, as an educator myself, and I try to use the way when I talked about that insider outsider status, I try to use the ways that I have that insider status. So my whiteness and my very less visible, like I don't present as someone who might feel oppressed in certain situations. I don't present as having a disability, whatever that might mean. And so I try to use my social and cultural capital as much as I can to push back as much as I can. That definitely takes privilege. You have to have a certain socioeconomic privilege to be able to risk professionally. But I think if you have different privileges in different areas, you have to use them as much as possible. And we have to help our students see what we are seeing.
I liked how you said how your disability only shows up in certain situations.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
and I think about
that.
the students in our schools whose disabilities often do and don't show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think especially with students who are autistic, especially young girls and young women, it doesn't show up as much because we're taught to camouflage and mask as much as possible. And I definitely see it manifesting in first year compositional spaces, certainly,
Yes.
as the demands get higher.
Interesting. Yes, I taught first year composition as well. And you
Mm-hmm.
can see the thinking and the language and how that is influenced in their writing and how they're struggle with the dominant academic language. Uh, they're struggling between, they're code switching and they're trying to sound smart.
Yeah. And also the ways that we so value the more structured, kind of linear kinds of composition
Yes.
in higher education. And that can be really hard for a lot of autistic folks who think very laterally.
Mhm.
So that's part of my dissertation work. So I'm very at the very beginnings of that work, but
Very good. Do we have any last questions? This has been incredible. I've learned stuff. I love learning new stuff. And this is stuff I'm going to be sharing with my graduate students. So
oh, great. Thank you.
these are important things we do not think about. I do not think about enough. All
Well,
right.
I really appreciate the opportunity and I appreciate everyone for taking the time. I know we're all exhausted. We have so much going on. So thank you so much.
Very good. This was such an important message. I'm glad you're able